So the landscape for food manufacturers and food marketers has really shifted dramatically in recent years. Consumers now want to have a much more complex dialogue about their food, their taste, their behaviors, their expectations have really changed. For some of us, like Jeff and me, it seems like we went from an era of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, where food branding was all about making the food seem magically delicious, to a time now when consumers really want to have that complex dialogue about what's on their plate or in their glass. And I think a more accurate remake of that movie would have the children asking about the working conditions of those Oompa Loompas. And are they being paid a fair wage? Not to mention why their hair is orange. And if the lickable wallpaper is sustainably sourced. So as Jeff mentioned, our Conscious Consumer Survey shows consumers just increasingly want to know more about the interaction of food production with environmental and social issues. In short, they want companies in the food and beverage arena to be good corporate citizens. And that's not an easy task, given the fact that food production really intersects with many health, environmental, and social challenges. So the panel here with me today is going to help sort through some of those challenges and what it means to be a good corporate citizen, and some approaches you can take to that. So with me, I have Ambassador Kenneth M. Quinn. He's president of the World Food Prize Foundation, as well as the former ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia. Next to him is Dr. Poovan Selvanathan. He's head of food and agriculture for the UN Global Compact. Now, we also had scheduled to be with us Brian Walsh from Time Magazine. Unfortunately, he got the flu and had to call in sick this morning. I did ask for a note from his mother. We're waiting on that. But he does send his regrets. But our esteemed panel, we're going to march on through. So Ken, the first question I have for you, first I'd just love a brief description of the mission of the World Food Prize Foundation, but then also you deal largely with the advancement of food production technology, and just how do you communicate that at a level, the importance of technology to sustainable food production for the masses?
Okay. Well, Ron, thank you, and Luke, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. Could I do something personal first? Is it James from London who's here? My daughter lives there. Would you look in on her when you go back? I think she's doing all right, but I'm not. So I had a 32-year career as a State Department Foreign Service officer. For the last 15 years, I've headed the World Food Prize. All the issues that are kind of on the front page of the paper today, whether it's about terrorism, domestic terrorism, international terrorism, Iranian nuclear issues, all of these things are something that goes through our organization now, or I dealt with in my career. In addition to, I'm from Dubuque, Iowa, and when I was going off to the State Department, I dreamed of going to London or Paris. I got sent to the Mekong Delta in the middle of the Vietnam War, and it's in the middle of the beginning of the Green Revolution. So I see the confluence in the way all of these things can work together. The World Food Prize is the quote-unquote Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. I brought all of these. Please take them away with you. They're one at each place that tells you what we do. But here's the World Food Prize 101. It's a $250,000 prize that we give every October in a wonderful ceremony in Des Moines at the state capitol. You all have to come. You're all invited. It's the Academy Awards of Food and Agriculture and Confronting Hunger. And I'm the MC, so I'm not Neil Patrick Harris, and I promise I won't come out in my underwear. Unless there's significant fundraising involved,
We'll pass
there's no shame. But we're a small 501c3 nonprofit, total of 12 people. But we have 1,300 people show up every October from 60 or 65 countries. They come to Des Moines for 3 or 4 days. We have a ceremony where we give our prize. We have a 3-day symposium called the Borlaug Dialogue. And as you'll see in the brochure, it's where Bill Gates gave his first speech on global agriculture and global food security, where Indra Nooyi launched Pepsi's concern with nutrition. The Secretary General, I was telling Dr. Benz that it was there a couple of years ago. But we also have smallholder farmers from Africa and Haiti. We have agribusiness executives. And then we have a high school youth program where we get a room filled with people like yourselves, and we run in 150 high school kids and 150 high school teachers. And our organization was founded by the least known great American, Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, on whose statue it is written in the U.S. Capitol, the man who saved 1 billion lives. He started the World Food Prize. My job is to carry forward his legacy. So there'll be a quiz later.
Thank you. And Pooban, tell us about the UN Global Compact and the food and agriculture business principles in particular, and how that's relevant to companies that maybe play in the middle of the food supply chain.
Well, thank you, Ron. First, I'd also like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. I was very impressed by the number of companies and the type of companies that have been gathered here. Some of you may already know the Global Compact, and in fact, many of your companies are probably already members of the Global Compact. The Global Compact for many years has been involved in aspects of delivering the United Nations message about the development agenda to corporations around the world. It was started 15 years ago by Kofi Annan, when I think the United Nations realized that to fulfill many of what were then the Millennium Development Goals, it was almost impossible to try to do that simply with public sector entities. So they needed to recruit the energy and the drive of the private sector to complement what the governments may be able to do in order to achieve these Millennium Development Goals. What we've found now, 50 years later, is if you look at the upcoming Sustainable Development Goals, they're littered with references as to how it is that private sector will be expected to contribute to various issues in the next 15 years. These goals have a 15-year policy-making time frame. Unfortunately, even though there are lots of references in the Sustainable Development text, Sustainable Development Goal text, there's no indication on exactly how they expect companies to come in and to do these things. And sometimes there's a lot of wishful thinking, I think, in policy circles, that they're simply going to say something and then the whole of the private sector is going to line up with incentives to deliver this. The Global Compact then plays into that space on how it is we may be able to translate what could be largely abstract goals into a policy setting, and then to make the reciprocity of the private sector to those policies and the achievement of those policies become a reality. The Global Compact identifies itself as a strategic policy initiative for corporations. So now moving from that compact realm into food and agriculture. The Food and Ag program at the Compact was actually started at Rio Plus 20. I joined the Global Compact in order to begin that stream of work. The difference between the food and agriculture business principles as a thematic within the Global Compact and every other thematic within the Global Compact is the food and ag principles come actually from the private sector. Everything else that you may read about the Compact in terms of women's empowerment, business for peace, climate change, and water, and so forth, those are actually the UN's agenda that is then pushed to the private sector. The food and ag business principles actually comes from a concern of the private sector, and essentially a consolidation of many of the voluntary initiatives that have been happening in the private sector over the last 10, 15 years, and bringing those to the governments to say, these things have been happening almost in spite of public policy. voluntary standards have been emerging because consumers have been demanding particular levels of performance. They've been looking for particular degrees of satisfaction, reassurance, assurance, and so companies have had to do this in spite of the fact that many of the regulatory frameworks and so forth simply don't go to that extent of being able to give that level of assurance. So when we started the Food and Ag work at Rio Plus 20, we had a number of companies in the room. Some of those represented here were probably there at that exploratory meeting. We then moved from that venue in Rio to an exploratory meeting at the FAO in Rome before we finally crafted the program. So what you see on the website now, the 6 principles that have emerged, took this path of approval, input, validation by about 1,000 businesses. So it's actually what businesses are businesses are willing to say they're willing to do in the next iteration of public policy. This is a huge shift because I remember when we introduced the principles finally last May, again at a meeting at the FAO, a number of my colleagues at the FAO and other agencies like WFP and so forth said, well, we've been talking about this for the last 50 years. This is fundamentally the development agenda. The difference was that now you have corporations using this language. And I think that is a fundamental shift in the way that people are thinking about the problem. Now, for me, I'm from the private sector. Well, I was from the private sector. That reassures me much, much more that you now have companies on the case of food security than the last 50 or 60 years of development practitioners talking about it, but not necessarily managing to achieve the type of security that we would have hoped for. So that's where the Global Compact is now. That's what it is that we're expecting to do.
That's great. And one question I would have, though, because you mentioned the companies that are already involved, and I think that, at least there's a perception that the largest companies are really, have the resources and the bandwidth to get involved. What about those small to medium-sized players within the food production chain? How can they take advantage of the business principles?
Well, I think this is also one of the outcomes of the type of thinking that governments and international agencies have had over the last 15 or 20 years. Usually, you would look at the bigger companies and try to have this top-down influence on, let's get our supply chain partners to do all of these things. That's a very governmental approach because it's like if you want to do something, forge a hammer and then beat everyone down to make sure that they follow or toe the line. I think in many cases governments have not appreciated that the sentiment of the consumer becoming more aware, becoming more informed, wanting to make better choices is actually driving the change. So they're seeing, or they're playing catch up, I think, to many, many consumers. Unfortunately, this band of consumers is probably still a little small, but they're the ones who then influence very directly this middle block of companies, because they're the ones who, if you're not making the right decision at the right time in the right market, you're simply not going to sell stuff. So that's, I think, where these smaller companies, the mid-sized companies, they don't have the tolerance of being able to cross-subsidize a very large and cash cow type market with a smaller market maybe around the world. They don't have that luxury of tolerance and shareholders from different places and so forth. The smaller companies, I think, are where you're being able to, where you can see real things happening because they're responding to very real specific needs in that part of the value chain.
And Ken, now your organization, furthers technology to help feed a hungry world primarily, but in doing that, obviously, the companies involved, are developing that technology also to make a profit, and so how do you see that balance between pursuing sustainable food production, making a profit, and helping contribute positively to a social issue like hunger?
Well, Norman Borlaug, when he worked all his life, was a huge proponent of biotechnology and therefore genetic modification. And he started out as a forest ranger. And he used to say, you know, I think I ended up saving more trees by being a proponent of biotechnology than I ever would have as a forest ranger. Because the promise of science, if you go to the National Academy of Science in Washington, it's written up in this beautiful rotunda. It says, science is the multiplier of the harvest. And so when you start looking at Africa, 80% of those who live in poverty are smallholder farmers, most of them women. How do you enable them to deal with the vagaries of climate change, climate volatility, droughts, floods? It's the promise of scientific research and the development of new crops that can withstand those challenges and be double or triple yielding and biofortified to bring nutrition to the malnourished. And so that production will be done based on companies being able to bring their products to them. So maybe you're a small maker of vaccines in Ames, Iowa, but if you're developing the vaccine that can deal with Ebola, and we had a big session on the agricultural impact of Ebola last year, that needs to get there, and it will allow those countries devastated by these terrible scourge to be able to be productive. And so for companies, food companies that are looking to resource, to enable production, and then to bring that production to market, here's where the opportunities are. And of course, with the world heading towards 9.5 billion people, you hear that figure all the time, but the question is, are we going to be able to produce enough food on this planet to feed all of those people? It's what we call the greatest challenge in human history, the greatest challenge our species has ever had to confront, whether we can do that or not. And so it is in that space that food companies are looking, how do you deal at the end of the road where the producers are? How do you get that product without it spoiling, without cutting down on the 30 to 40% that's wasted to market? And then how do those companies now interact in the global trading system that your companies have helped create and which are essential to their bottom line profits in the future? So it's there, and the intersection of all of this comes now around the biotechnology area, because it's questioned in our country and in Europe and in other developed countries about whether is it healthy, things should be in the food supply or not. And at the same time, it seems critically important for those in poverty. So that's kind of the equation, and we endeavor to bring people together to talk about every year in Des Moines. And you know, it's interesting, when I started, and I invited the CEO of Land O'Lakes to come and speak, and he came, and somebody said to me, you know, CEOs of food companies never come to conferences like this. So now we've had, probably many of your bosses have been to our event, and it's expected. And so that reflects a change even in the last 10 years.
Well, the greatest challenge in human history. No pressure there, folks. Yeah, get working on that. But you bring up an interesting topic in that, you know, to understand these complex issues. I mean, you brought up a nexus with Ebola even in food. You know, it does require a certain level of science literacy. And I know some Pew research just last week showed that, you know, by and large in America, we're not real science literate. And I think where companies struggle with it in explaining how they approach production, how they approach, you know, resource conservation, if it involves technology like GMOs, you know, they fear possibly that if you explain too much, you end up scaring the consumer rather than informing the consumer. So Poovan, you know, through your work with the UN Global Compact, you know, how do you tackle, you know, that challenge of making sustainable agriculture just understandable to the masses?
Okay, so I suppose the first thing would be we shouldn't be afraid of complexity. The problem is that a lot of complexity is presented in a very complicated fashion. And that makes complexity seem daunting. But the food systems of the world, together with so many other systems, are very complex systems, and we shouldn't deny the complexity that exists. I think what is unreasonable and irresponsible is when people try to pass the necessity for understanding this complexity onto consumers and onto others. If I needed to understand the entire workings of a wire harness or the internal combustion engine or jet propulsion in order to take a flight, that might be a problem for me. So I think that food companies and others, policymakers and so forth, have a responsibility to take things down to a level that is appropriate for a consumer to be able to make a choice in a confident and assured fashion, and not to any other degree. So if I am a consumer and I'm presented, for example, with a myriad of labels on packet, and then I'm expected to understand what all these labels are, and then also to try to work out which labels are not there in order to give me complete assurance that this product is actually safe, I think that's a very unreasonable position. And if we look at, let's say the history of brands come with a certain inherent trust, and that's why people follow brands. I think we need to get to the point where the whole sustainability paradigm, and particularly the food issue, sits behind a brand on how it is that people can say, well, I just want to walk into the store, I want to know that everything that is on every shelf here has not been foisted upon me by irresponsible actors who are doing the wrong things in the wrong places, with the wrong people. We have to get to that point quickly. This is one of the philosophies that we adopted when we actually issued the Food and Agriculture Business Principles. For those of you who may have seen them, they are less than 250 words across 6 principles. There are reams of guidance documents or process documents that were generated over the 3 years, thousands and thousands of papers from all of the meetings and so forth. But I think when they finally landed at my desk, whenever it was, I looked at that and I thought, well, it's not necessary for people to understand the process that we went through to get to these 248 words. Do these 248 words convey the spirit of everything that we need to say that we considered and that we hope that others will consider, in order that whatever they see in front of them can be categorized as sustainable and trustworthy? And so that's what we chose to do, simply to issue that. It wasn't even for the consumers, it was actually for companies. Because I think when companies come to the table today, if we expect the communications department or the corporate affairs department to understand everything that the operations department has known for the last 15 years, I think that's unreasonable. And it's also necessary, I think, for the operations department to not necessarily try to validate their own existence by teaching the corporate communications group everything that they've known for the last 15 years and then wondering why they don't get it. Because the corporate communications group wants to know about how to sell the stuff that you are doing, as opposed to know the stuff that you're doing. I've had battles internally with corp comms people for most of my life, but I think achieved a sort of certain serenity when I realized it's not necessary for them to know how the car is built. They just want to know what color sells and how it is that we're going to convey this message appropriately. And that's their job, and that's what they're good at, and that's what they do. So I think this idea of complexity and simplicity is something that still has to work its way through the engine of public policy making and of how corporations represent themselves and so forth. But I don't see this as being a problem. I mean, at some point, people simply resign themselves to, okay, I'm never going to understand it. So let's just get on with it. I hope we get to that point sooner rather than later.
And Ken, really this is about storytelling and how to build that story around, how are you approaching these things to make it more understandable, more the color of the car rather than, the makeup of the engine. And in your experiences, are there areas related to food production, distribution, disposal, that perhaps companies are just missing, that would have significant impact and really would build this understandable story about how they're contributing positively to sustainable agriculture and society in general?
Well, since a number of my donors are in the room, their companies are all doing this brilliantly. But, that's an intriguing question on that. I think, and sometimes it's a little bit like buying automobile insurance. It's too hard to ever understand it, so you have to decide whether it's going to be the Gecko from Geico or Aaron Rodgers. Who you're going to trust? Who do you feel good about when giving your money to get your car insurance? And so the question then is, who is speaking? And there are a lot of women here, but my belief is dealing with this issue and confronting it and dealing with the science of it, that in foreign countries and in our own, women are integral and central to this. And I think would become more the trusted spokespersons on these issues. And one of the things that I've been involved in discussions we hope to emphasize is to promote women, young girls and young women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And of course it should be STEAM, should it be science, technology, agricultural science, engineering, and math. And we need a good firm to engineer that, but because that's where American jobs are going to be, and that's where these issues are going to be best confronted. The worrying thing is whether science is continuing to be seen as the validating principle. Because you've seen the whole debate about vaccines. There will be a similar debate going on, and there is in Europe, and there has been for several decades around genetically modified foods. And even though you have authoritative people say these are all safe and they're not caused any harm, there is still a very significant body of informed, educated people in Europe who have, whether it's an emotional or preferential or environmental, whatever their reasons they've thought about, feel strongly about that. And this is where it will come. America has produced the greatest aggregation of agricultural and food scientists ever assembled on our planet. One of the great achievements of the United States and of European countries. And we followed the British in research on this. And so we have people who know this, but speaking about it and presenting it it's the communications problem. It's the issue. The other really important one to deal with is biodiversity, because we have to sustain this. You can't just produce enough food for 2050 and then we're all done. We've got to do it again, because there may be, if the UN is right, there may be as many as 11 billion people on the planet by the end of the century. And so we have to have the water, have to have the soil, it has to be, the nutrients have to be put back in it without having it run off and go down our rivers and create dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. And we have to have a great diversity of crops to be able to produce and do the research and to do the traditional plant breeding to produce crops that are even stronger in that. So it's educating the next generation, emphasizing science, promoting biodiversity, and finding ways, because I live in Iowa, bitterly divided political state. All the presidential candidates are there. But the one thing where you can get the most conservative Tea Party people and the most liberal, progressive people from the Democratic Party all come together, they'll all be in the picture, is about honoring Norman Borlaug and honoring our state's legacy of feeding the world. it's the one thing that everybody's proud of. They all will come together. And it is probably America's most powerful and potent, I don't want to say weapon, but shared belief that at a time when there's little, it appears, that unite us, that going back and looking that, honoring that, seems to be a way that people can have conversations and they can at least agree on that, what the policies are to get there. So those, to me, are kind of the elements. They're what we endeavor to promote, what we endeavor to preserve as part of Norman Borlaug's legacy, and to have that opportunity. And it was in Des Moines at the World Food Prize where we honored an Israeli scientist in 2012, where the Secretary General of the United Nations came, and he had been nominated for our $250,000 prize by 3 Arab Muslim scientists from 3 Arab countries. So it is having moments like this where that food and agriculture can be a way of stepping across sometimes the widest chasms that divide people, whether it's ethnically, religiously, politically, diplomatically. You know, I went to Iran last August to talk about food and biotechnology and agriculture, because in 1959, not many of you will remember, but the US and the Soviet Union were, this close to nuclear war. And Khrushchev came to America and went to a farm in Iowa and got interested in corn, and it led to exchanges over the next decades that created an atmosphere so that Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev could be at Reykjavik and agree on significant adjustments and easing of tensions in that nuclear confrontation.
I gotta say, you make Iowa sound more appealing than anybody. I grew up in that state, and nobody has sold Iowa better than you. Oh, my God, right? Everybody on a plane, we're going to Des Moines. My home state is proud. Poovan, a key to the UN Global Compact is these private-public partnerships, partnerships with NGOs. From your perspective, what maybe is the kind of the hidden gem that maybe they're missing to tackle, to positively communicate to the masses the importance of sustainable food production and that, a company is a good corporate citizen?
I think that the notion of corporate citizenship, of course, has been around for a while. Being able to reckon which companies are good and which companies are bad, everybody has an opinion on that in one way or the other. What I think is dawning on the global governance structure as a whole is that without companies, we're not going to do or be able to do what it is that we need to do. So the inevitability of partnerships between the public and the private sector, and this idea of joined up solutions on who can have impact in the places where they have certain core competencies and strengths, whether that be a government or whether it's a corporation. That's the kind of discussion which is now coming up very, very prominently, and people are not afraid to have that discussion anymore. It's no longer a question of saying, well, because it's this type of thing, education or rail services or whatever, this must be in the domain of governments. Now I think there is a much more enlightened approach to, well, where do the strengths lie, where is the capacity for research and development, where is the capacity for deployment and distribution, where is the capacity for changing mindsets. Usually corporations have a better way to change mindsets and deliver the types of incentives than many governments have. So I think this appreciation of what even constitutes a public-private partnership is changing. In the last, let's say, 3 or 4 decades, the nature of public-private partnerships tended to be where the government still played a very regulatory role and essentially subcontracted a set of services out to the private sector under certain conditions. That's a very bad way of doing things. What this usually resulted in is very weak public-private partnerships where companies were not bringing their A games to the table. What they were really doing was simply responding to a certain set of terms of reference which governments were putting out. If you look at places where PPPs have really worked, it's where the government has said, listen, what we would like is for the situation to perform in this way. You do the innovation and you come up with solutions which nobody in our civil service can possibly think of, because none of us have been in the position where we needed to sell any of our stuff because we're the government. So I think that's resulted in very dynamic and aggressive solutions. If we sort of scan the press, what I find particularly interesting now is applying some of these problems, these global governance problems, into the realm of what has become the norm outside of government, which is the management of big data and knowledge. I noticed, for example, there's a representative from the Hershey Corporation. I was reading yesterday about Hershey's involvement with a company called Palantir, and where they're looking at Palantir. Some of you may know, essentially developed systems on how to track somebody's phone number out of millions of phone numbers and work out the calls they were making and this sort of thing, and that whole PRISM stuff. That's the kind of realm that they work in. But it's nice to see that now there's a company that's looking at how to use that technology to determine how much sugar to put into a particular product and where that product is going to be distributed, and the profiles of the consumers that are going to be buying that product. That realm of taking what Facebook and the others have been doing in the numbers of billions and applying it to the solution of having to feed billions is now coming to the fore. It's becoming clear that it can be done. One of the things the Global Compact has been looking at in my own work is how do we flip the model so that, for example, of all the companies that are involved here in this room, you are supported by billions of farmers, one way or the other. You're supported by billions of SMEs in all of the countries in which you work, your supply chains and so forth. How do we flip it so that when somebody feels that they need to get something done as a government, they're not haranguing you? What they're trying to do is to create an enabling opportunity for all of those SMEs to enable your business to do better. And I think that's the kind of thing that the United Nations and the whole government fraternity should be able to say, rather than a few sporadic or disparate CSR programs, or those companies who are willing to do well because they seem to have achieved a certain plateau of self-enlightenment, whereas that's maybe 1% of the corporate community on the planet, whereas the 99% are still not doing such good things. You need to have the government to sort of be able to create that level playing field, or to raise the tide for all corporate boats to float in a particular way. And that's happening now. And I think the way to do that is to actually change it to say, what can we do for 1 billion farmers? If we can get 1 billion farmers to be working better, naturally that's going to gravitate up to make all of the companies in this room have better products and have more sustainable resources and supply chains and other things. Going the other way down, from the top down, the only tool that you have is a supply contract. And I would guess that if you would even go through the companies in this room and to say, well, to what level can you assure me that your supply contract is really delivering the type of performance that you expect? I would think there would be very, very few people who could point to say, all the coffee that I source is absolutely 100% sustainable. All the cocoa that I source is absolutely child labor free. It's just not possible. And I don't think, again, to go back to what I said about responsibility and irresponsibility, I don't think it would be responsible for us to expect that of you. What we would have to do is to say, in order for us to enable you to have that assurance and to pass it on, we need to work with the lowest tiers, because that's actually what governments can do, and that's their job. So if we want sovereignty and if we want governments to behave well, look after the entire country, not simply the bits where the investments are going to be coming in, not simply the bits where you want to give tax havens and tax breaks.
Well, and Ken, that kind of gets to, you mentioned the empowerment of young girls and women as a key. What are some other issues at that kind of grassroots, building the infrastructure and making sure that the small farm holder, is supported rather than the top-down approach?
Well, one of the other issues that has to be at the forefront to me is the issue of nutrition and health, because now there is, the nexus again that Hippocrates outlined several thousand years ago of let food be your medicine. Well, food is the medicine in the sense of whether it brings vitamins, biofortification, or it doesn't have, you're not eating unhealthy or unbalanced diets. One of the very earliest programs we did was the dual global challenges of obesity and malnutrition, back before even Mayor Bloomberg was talking about that. And so now this is come to the fore. One of the newest developments of the orange sweet potato and the awareness of this that's being developed by African scientists and being spread out to the lowest levels in societies in Africa. But to get any of these benefits to smallholder farmers, to make them into small business persons who are running a farm that's able to produce and can produce the quality that companies want to buy. And so the extension work that needs to be done, the sort of the equivalent of the land-grant universities, extension systems in the least developed parts of the world are so critical, but they'll never get there unless you build the roads. I was saying to Puvan, I was such an admirer of Malaysia because you can just see all the incredible rural roads that were built in that country and how every time you drove down one, you could track the economic, agricultural development, uplifting people out of poverty, reducing child mortality. So it's essential. I was saying only half jokingly that the most important election coming up in this year isn't about who's going to be the Republican candidate for president, but it's who's going to become the new president of the African Development Bank, because it's such a transformational, has the potential to be such a transformational agency on that continent. So people are more and more aware of health, and they are desperately want to be aware of food safety. So we talked about brands. When you look at the issues, say, in China, that when they were confronted with problems that were developing out someplace in their agricultural production system and they had no means to trace it, what they did was they brought Taiwanese-based companies to China to open supermarkets. And if you're a middle-class person in China, what you want is you want your family, because you only have one child, to be safe and healthy, and you want to be able to go someplace and buy food that you can rely on has been tested. And that's why the FDA and USDA inspection systems are so important in our country, because we take it for granted, but it's not that way everywhere. So those kind of things are so important, and your companies, those who with your brands, as you were saying, that's so critical to that assurance.
All right, I'd like to open up the questions to the group. I believe, have some microphones that will be passed around. Just raise your hand, don't be shy.
You talk about sustainability, you talk about food safety. Why couldn't teaching every African village organic farming also be the solution? Why does it have to be a Monsanto-driven solution?
Yeah. Well, I'm not spokesman for Monsanto. They give us money, so and I know people. It doesn't have to be. Shouldn't be. Farmers should be free to choose what they want, and there are a lot of impressive, cheap, what are called agro-economic or agroecological solutions of ways of dealing in ways of what you plant and what you plant next to something and how you deal with insects. Doesn't need to be that at all. And farmers want to do what's effective and what's cheap. Whether they're in Africa or Iowa or Australia, wherever, farmers are instinctively interested in that. So I would say what's important is to give them the range of opportunities. Because I worked in villages starting back in the 1960s. And farming is really hard. And you put back-breaking labor, and most peasant farmers and underdeveloped countries, they live on the edge of survival. And 1 year, one bad crop, and you and your family can be finished. And so they're reluctant to change and are hesitant to do things because they want to do what's tried and true. And yet, they face these new threats of crops that they may have more flooding, they may have more drought, terrible issues that can finish off their crop, or pests that can come. So whatever tools there can be that are available to them and need to come from trusted sources. That's why the extension workers from universities are so important. Companies have sales representatives who will come and say, you ought to try this and do that. I mean, that's what happened in this country with agriculture. So it doesn't need to be at all. And Norman Borlaug would be the first person to say that, but he had a heart for farmers. So just imagine Mexican farmers put their own money together to put up a statue of him in Obregon. And in India, scientists and farmers put their own money in to erect a statue of an American scientist. And the Iranians in Iran tried to buy a copy of the statue that's going in the US Capitol to put it up on their campus in Iran. So who could imagine putting up a statue of a foreigner, of an American, but because people knew in all those places that his heart was for the poor farmer. And I think that's what I've seen when I've seen farmers, refugees, hungry people confronted, want to do what works for them, not what helps the bottom line of any one company or another. I think that's what would motivate most, not just most Americans, most people in the world who work on this.
Well, because if you watch some of those documentaries like Food Matters and Food Inc., and there's a new one called GMO OMG, what they talk about is that GMOs might increase yield in the short term, but that in the long term it's not sustainable, and that really empowering farmers to practice organic farming is actually what is more sustainable for the next 100 years. And so I would just invite everyone to consider that alternative point of view.
Absolutely should be considered, and we try to bring all those points of view to our conference. It's really essential to look at all of that, because if that's and Norman Borlaug would the first say, if you can feed everybody with organic farming, that's great. We should do it.
I would just add one quick thing to that. I'm with Purdue Farms, and just for a matter of background, we are now the largest producer of organic chicken. But I think there's often a misperception that organic and science are diametrically opposed. There's a big difference between organic production agriculture, which uses organic methods, but constantly aims to be more efficient, versus the pastoralists who sort of want to, wind the clock back to, let's go back to 1920 and, a little pickup truck, a little red tractor, and a couple of acres.
Chickens are wandering free in the yard.
Hi, my name is Nicole. Nicole Reed. I'm a communications manager for Down to Earth Farmers Markets. We manage farmers markets in and around New York City. I also, my family's from Iowa, and in agriculture in Iowa.
Shout out to Iowa.
Little Iowa pride. Yeah. One thing that just came to my mind in the discussion this morning in talking about the GMO discussion that we're having. One thing, in thinking about transparency and corporate communications, something that I think consumers, and I say this both as a communications professional and a consumer, one thing that's been problematic is that many corporations are fighting GMO labeling. And I think that, you know, consumers then see that as corporations or large food companies, I don't need to put a size on there, but basically that there's something to hide. So I would really advocate that food companies that make GMOs, if there is no problem with it, you know, then that be something that the food companies promote as a badge of honor rather than something to be avoided and don't tell anybody that GMOs are in here.
No, I mean, it's the very compelling argument when people say, look, I just want to know what's in the food. And doesn't matter whether I, you know, whatever I think, I want to know if there are genetically modified foods included in the food or not. I just want to know, put it on the label. I think that from what I've heard, people in agribusiness companies or food companies say is that usually if something goes on a label, it means that it's threatening or noxious or in certain amounts, and that once you do that, that will be you know, the beginning of a branding, to use the term. It'll be branded as that there's something wrong with this, that there is something that's potentially injurious to it, and it comes down to it. So they're kind of, you know, compelling arguments. People know, and we have a great farmers market in Des Moines too, so another reason to come. But I think but your point is one that resonates with a lot of people, and that it's clear.
And I think what we're seeing is this complexity that we were talking about. You know, these issues are very complex. You have, you know, an unseemly endless population growth, but there's a finite amount of arable land. We want to preserve biodiversity. You do have this lack of education of consumers. I'd be interested, Poovan, from the UN Global Compact's standpoint, you know, how do you approach technology as it pertains to sustainable agriculture?
Well, I mean, as I said before, I think that technology is going to be a great savior. I think that the technological improvements that have happened in agriculture, even as the ambassador has mentioned, you know, have largely contributed to the fact that we are surviving today. If we didn't have those improvements, and for all, you know, to whatever extent we may bemoan industrial agriculture and this, that, and the other, certainly when my parents were making decisions at the supermarket, they didn't have the luxury of checking on the internet whether this was, you know, the thing that they should be buying, and we as children grew up eating that food. Now, you know, as different parents, I hope that my children would have simply a different perspective on things. But I can't blame my parents for not knowing what they may or may not have known. So I think that technology has helped that migration move across. And now when we go into the realm of labeling as well, I think that technology is going to help those people who need to know. I think the opportunity of simply putting everything on pack is an unreasonable way of burdening those who don't really need to have, you know, that much information. It goes back to this brand idea. What we want is to trust what is being presented to us. And if I want to know, then I'm going to go off and find out. And people do that. And good for them. The idea of dogma, I think, plays into this very strongly. I mean, we find that many camps, whether they're GMO camps or organic camps or particular product labeling camps and so forth, somehow, you know, can skew the discussion obviously to what they want the discussion to be. I think we need to be wary that not everyone has the opportunity to see both sides of an argument. If you've only got access to one channel, that's the channel you're going to be listening to, and perhaps, you know, people in this room get to see 3 different newspapers every day and log on to 3 different websites, and that's great for us. And I would struggle with the idea of how to then present my point of view in a particular context if I know that context, that point of view is unsustainable in that context. If I were to say now, for example, you know, to all the farmers in India, you know, my perspective on organic farming is this, and this is what you should do, that's going to be a problem. If I were to say that tobacco farming is bad because you grow this stuff, but you may not be able to afford the cigarettes that end up in the rest of the world, that's also, I think, irresponsible. So I think when we take the gamut of global issues and all of the possible solutions and the possible outcomes that could happen, we need to respect that these things exist for a particular reason. Some things are good, some things are bad, some things have malicious intent, some things don't. But we need to be conscious of our own perspective on these issues before presenting something in a particular way. I hope that gives you every kind of caveat possible.
I just want to go back to Willy Wonka.
Yes, hi, my name is Dinah Diaz, and no, I'm not from Iowa. I'm from beautiful New Jersey. I work for a company called Ingredion. We're a food ingredient supplier. I'm the marketing manager. And one of the trends that I've identified or have seen is that a lot of consumers are now shopping the perimeter of the store. They're shopping in their local markets. And the question to the panel is, has that impacted any of the strategies or the discussions that you've had within your network of people? And how are you addressing that and the sustainability of that effort long term?
Sorry, can you just clarify the periphery of stores? What do you mean they are?
They're not shopping the packaged foods. They're more shopping the fresh, the vegetables, the locally grown, the natural aspect. Right. And how is that going to be sustainable long term? Have you identified that as a trend in your discussions with the companies that you deal with the farmers?
Yeah, so I think just to once again make the distinction, people are doing that, I think, because they are beginning to appreciate more that there is something outside of the packaged food world or the convenience food world. It's not necessarily because, and maybe here at this point in time, they also think that all of this fresh food is necessarily healthier than packaged food, which is not necessarily the case. When we talk about technology and we talk about certain recipe formulas and other things, if I were to say which companies are actually making the efforts that would be necessary to make more nutritious products as a whole, granted, fresh produce, if it's delivered fresh and is consumed fresh, is probably the better way to go. But not everybody has the time to do that. Not everybody has the money to do that. So there still has to be this other realm of people and companies doing things to make sure that what they do put into the package shelves have got the robustness and the resilience to deliver the nutritional value that we want. And the larger part of the world is still going to operate in that way. So, I mean, certainly from the UN side, we don't take a position one way or the other. It's going to be contextually based. But that's where I think the big companies really have an opportunity to exert leverage. And if I look at the Unilevers and the Nestlés and others, they spend as much time making sure that what is now coming to shelf has less sodium, has less sugar, has whatever it's going to be. And that's a very good thing to do, because the transition of where we are today as a world with our entire dependence on industrial food systems and every supermarket shelf being full all the time to wherever it's going to be is a fairly long journey, in the same way as climate change still requires coal to be burned on 50% of the planet, simply because that's what you've got to do, otherwise people won't have energy. So it's that kind of transition that we need to think about with food as well. And again, judgment is a very dangerous thing, and we can sit in a particular place and make a judgment on someone else, but the context, I think, must really be taken into account. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but it's how we're thinking.
Yeah, I would just add the governor of New Jersey spends a lot of time in Iowa, so yeah, maybe more than in New Jersey. And but to the point is that happens because people go to the supermarket here in the United States, know that all that food is safe. So if you took all the same people and put them in a country that didn't have the same regimen and certainty, they probably would be going to say, oh, I'm going to buy this one, this brand, this box, because I'm sure, and I don't know where this other food has come from, what it was fertilized with, what might be on it or so. So it's kind of where you are. Second thing about farmers markets. So I went and spent a whole day, one of our legislators, and with people who wanted to have more farmers markets and have the farm industry be welcoming to those people who wanted to do small farms producing for nearby communities, because that's what the American agriculture system looked like 80, 100 years ago. But what's happened is that whole system is gone. And there are no more markets, there are no more local processing places, because there's trucks and refrigeration, and food that gets produced is moved great distances with great efficiency. And so if you want to start that, you can do it here, you can do it in big cities, you can do it even in a place like Des Moines. But you get beyond that, it becomes very, very hard to have it in any kind of appreciable size in doing that. So it's an intriguing question.
If I could just add, so I do a lot of shopping, I mean, for food. And I live here. And so I would go to, let's say, the Union Square Market, or then go to Whole Foods, go to Trader Joe's, go to Fairways, wherever it is, and check out a lot of things. Sometimes, if I ask certain questions of people who are producing and at the farmer's market, the most common question I get back is, or the most common comment from the farmers who have these stores is, nobody ever asks me that question. And the question is usually, is what you're doing organic? Because it's produced as local, but it's not necessarily organic. And it's not advertised as such, so there's no deception going on here. Then you go to Whole Foods and you look at their grading system of 1 to 5, and you ask, well, what is what relative to, let's say, Fairway or Trader Joe's and other things? And if I'm in the business, and I'm asking these questions, I honestly feel very sorry for someone who has to go out there who's not in the business and simply have to say, in New York City, compared to many, many other places in the US where you can't even get this sort of quality of produce or spectrum of choice, I think it would be very, very challenging. I mean, I would have no way of understanding how all of this worked unless I had an assured or trusted partner, which goes back to the brand idea. If there's some store that can say, everything on the shelf, you can trust, that would be so much easier for people to begin to make choices.
All right, well, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. And I think we've taken the complexity out of this topic completely. And so we're done here.
It was easy.
But if you have questions, please afterwards, ask the panelists. I want to thank you both. The experience and expertise that you bring is phenomenal. I really appreciate you joining us today. Our next panel is going to discuss how to shape content that reflects consumers' growing sophistication and curiosity about food. We've touched on that. Moderating that will be Tina Elmowitz, who's a principal with Gibbs RBB, and she's got more than 20 years of experience managing award-winning communications programs for food and beverage companies. So I'd like to invite Tina and her panel up here.